Before there was Israel, before the tablets of stone, before the desert march, before the 12 tribes bore the weight of covenant, there was already a name. Not a new word etched in Hebrew, not a symbol crafted by a chosen people, but a name that echoed in the breath of creation and lingered in the longing of forgotten generations. Yahweh, the one who is, who was, and who will always be. And the question no one dares to ask is this: was Yahweh ever Israel's secret alone? Or have we misunderstood something ancient, something far older than any nation? Long before Jacob became Israel, before Moses trembled at the burning bush, men and women in lands far from Canaan were already whispering that name. Some built altars, some offered songs, some waited in silence, but somehow they knew. The worship of Yahweh didn't begin at Sinai. It began in a mystery, carried through time by those who were never written into Israel's genealogy, but were still known by heaven. So if Yahweh was worshipped before Israel ever existed, then what does that say about the covenant? Was it truly born at Mount Sinai? Or was Sinai simply the moment it became visible to the world? And if the name was known outside the boundaries of one people, then maybe, just maybe, it's being whispered still by those who have no tribe, no temple, no title, but have always longed for the voice behind the veil. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a doorway, a question aimed not at the past, but at you. Could it be that the name you thought was for someone else was actually meant for you all along? Step with us into this forgotten worship, not to rewrite scripture, but to read what was always there, hidden in plain sight. The burning bush wasn't the beginning, it was a reminder. When Moses stood barefoot before the fire that did not consume, he asked the most human of questions: "What is your name?" And from within the flame, the voice of God answered with a phrase that would echo through eternity: "I am who I am." Exodus 3:14. Not a name in the conventional sense, but a revelation of being itself. Eternal, self-existent, unshakable. Yet in the very next breath, God adds something even more startling. Say to the Israelites, "Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you." Exodus 3:15. Did you catch that? The God of your fathers. This wasn't the first time the name had been spoken. It wasn't new, it was ancient. Which means the bush didn't burn to introduce Yahweh, it burned to reawaken memory. The memory of a covenant passed down through generations. The memory of a God who had already been known, already been called upon by those who walked the earth long before Moses was born. In the Hebrew language, Yahweh is a form of the verb to be. It doesn't just tell us who God is, but declares that He is, always. He wasn't Israel's invention. He is the one who was reaching long before the law, speaking before the priesthood, revealing Himself to the hearts that searched for Him in the quiet dark. And here is where the reframe begins. What if the name Yahweh was never meant to be a national trademark, but a covenantal signature, written not on flags or scrolls, but on hearts that sought Him? In ancient Jewish tradition, the true name of God wasn't granted to the worthy, but to the willing, to those who drew near, not through genealogy, but through humility. Could it be that when God declared himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he wasn't limiting his name to a bloodline, but recalling a legacy of intimacy, a lineage of listeners? The bush burned not for identity, but for remembrance, because sometimes even chosen ones forget who called them. So no, Sinai wasn't the beginning. It was the turning of a page in a story already unfolding, and the name revealed there. It had always been whispering, waiting, calling from generation to generation to anyone who would turn aside and listen. Long before there was a temple, long before there were laws written on stone, before the word Israel ever crossed human lips, there were voices calling upon a name, one that carried through the silence of early earth like a thread of memory sewn into the soul of humanity. In Genesis chapter 4:26, just 3 generations from Adam, it is written, "At that time, people began to call upon the name of Yahweh." This moment, quiet, ancient, often overlooked, is a crack in the foundation of what we thought we knew. Enosh, the grandson of Adam, is the first recorded to speak the sacred name, not as a theologian, not as a priest, but as a man in a world unraveling, choosing to reach for something eternal. This is not just an interesting footnote, it's a revelation. The worship of Yahweh didn't originate with Moses or even with Abraham. It goes further back to a time before nations, before covenants carved in stone, before any chosen people existed. The name was known, and it was called upon, not by perfect men, but by those who carried the longing to know who their Creator truly was. By the time we reach Abraham in Genesis 12:8, we see him arriving in Canaan, building an altar and calling upon the name of Yahweh. This isn't a new invention, this is continuity, a thread passed from mouth to mouth, from father to son, not written but remembered. Abraham was not discovering Yahweh for the first time. He was responding to a name that had already shaped the world, a name that lingered in stories, in altar stones, in whispered prayers beneath unfamiliar skies. And here is where we reframe the story we've inherited. What if the early chapters of Genesis are not just about the fall of man, but also about the survival of covenant? A covenant not yet formalized, not yet inscribed, but carried like fire in the hearts of those who refused to forget. From Adam to Seth, from Seth to Enosh, from Enosh to Noah, and Noah to Shem, there existed a lineage of remembrance, a silent priesthood not defined by law, but by reverence. This was the unwritten covenant, not one born in bureaucracy, but in brokenness. A yearning passed down through generations who knew they belonged to someone greater. The worship of Yahweh, then, is not a product of Israel's history. It is Israel's inheritance from something older, something broader, something holy. The name didn't come from a nation. The name gave birth to the nation, which means the first guardians of the covenant weren't governments or tribes, they were families, families that chose to remember, families that chose to build altars not to idols of power, but to the one whose presence needed no temple to be known. And if the name could be carried in such a fragile vessel as oral memory, what does that say about its power and the kind of people God entrusts it to? The story of Yahweh didn't begin with a people. It began with a promise. And the promise was never small. It was always meant to reach beyond bloodlines, beyond languages, beyond empires, calling anyone willing to remember the name older than nations. Some of the most extraordinary worshippers of Yahweh were never called Israelites. They didn't carry the law, they didn't walk through the Red Sea, and their names were rarely mentioned in national genealogies. And yet, they knew him deeply, intimately, reverently. These men stood outside the borders of a chosen nation, but somehow stood inside the presence of the one true God. Their stories are not just footnotes, they are mirrors, because if they were not forgotten by heaven, then neither are you. Melchizedek appears like a sudden breeze in the ancient text, brief, mysterious, and profoundly holy. Genesis 14 tells us that this priest, the king of Salem, brought bread and wine to Abraham and blessed him in the name of El Elyon, the Most High God. He wasn't from Abraham's family. He wasn't from Israel. Israel didn't even exist yet. And yet, Abraham, the father of the covenant, recognized him, honored him, and gave him 1/10 of everything. Hebrews 7 adds to the wonder, calling Melchizedek without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life. Some believe he was a foreshadowing of Christ himself. But even if not, one thing is clear. Melchizedek was a priest of Yahweh before priests were ever defined by tribe. Then there's Jethro, the priest of Midian, father-in-law of Moses, yet a stranger to the people of the covenant. In Exodus 18, he comes to visit Moses after the exodus from Egypt. And what does he do? He rejoices over what Yahweh has done. He blesses the name. He offers sacrifices. And Moses, Aaron, and the elders of Israel eat with him before God. No one corrects him. No one excludes him. Because the Spirit recognized what bloodline could not. Jethro knew the God of Israel, not because he was born into the right people, but because he responded with the right heart. And then there's Job, the man who lived far from Canaan, in a land east of the Jordan, surrounded not by Hebrews, but by friends from distant regions. And yet Job doesn't speak of a distant deity. He pleads with God, he wrestles with him, he trusts him, and he calls him by name, Yahweh. In the depths of his suffering, he still says, "Blessed be the name of Yahweh," Job 1:21. And later, with trembling hope, he declares, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth." Job 19:25. This is not the language of someone repeating tradition. This is the cry of someone who knows. Here is the reframe. What if being part of the covenant was never about tribal identity, but about spiritual intimacy? What if Yahweh has always had his worshippers scattered across the earth, people who never made it into Israel's census, but made it into heaven's record? What if you, watching now, feel like you don't belong because you don't carry the language or the customs or the name of a people, and yet you carry the ache to know the God who made you? Then perhaps you are not unlike Jethro, or Job, or Melchizedek. Perhaps the thread of covenant didn't skip you. It's been drawing you all along. The ones who knew him without a tribe remind us that Yahweh does not check passports. He listens for hearts, and those who seek him with honesty will find that the gates of covenant are wider than we've been told. There are moments in Scripture that feel like a disruption, as if God intentionally breaks the pattern we thought we understood. Balaam is one of them, a prophet who shouldn't be a prophet, A man outside the covenant, outside the priesthood, outside the story, yet suddenly, unmistakably, Yahweh speaks to him, not through signs or riddles, not in symbols, but directly, with words, with commands, with presence. Numbers 22:9 simply says, "And God came to Balaam," as if that were the most natural thing in the world. But it wasn't. Balaam wasn't a Hebrew. He lived in Pethor, near the Euphrates, far from the tabernacle, far from the ark, far from the promises made to Abraham. And yet, when the messengers of Balak came to hire him, Balaam didn't consult idols or omens. He went to Yahweh, and Yahweh answered, "This should unsettle us, because it challenges our assumptions. If the covenant belongs to Israel, why is Yahweh speaking to someone who doesn't bear the sign of it? If prophecy is a gift for the faithful, why is it being given to someone who, by all appearances, is spiritually compromised?" And yet, Balaam hears, not once, but repeatedly. In Numbers 23:8, he proclaims, "How can I curse whom God has not cursed?" And in one of the most stunning moments of all prophetic literature, he declares, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel." This isn't just blessing, it's messianic vision, a glimpse of the coming king, spoken not by Moses, not by a priest, but by a Gentile seer standing on a mountain, hired to do the opposite. And that's the twist. Balaam didn't deserve it. He wasn't righteous. His heart was conflicted, and later scriptures even condemn him. And yet for a moment the voice of Yahweh moved through him, not because of who he was, but because of who Yahweh is, sovereign, free, bound by no borders. This is the climax of the forgotten worship, that Yahweh's voice is not confined to temples or tribes. It reaches through walls, through motives, through systems, through history. It chooses the unlikely, the flawed, the outsider, not to validate their condition, but to prove his freedom. So let's ask the question no one wants to ask. If Yahweh can speak through Balaam, what does that mean for us? What does it say about who he's willing to use, and who might already be hearing him without ever knowing they're allowed to? You may not feel holy. You may not carry the right background or language or theology. But Yahweh is not waiting for your perfection. He's listening for your attention. And sometimes the ones we would label disqualified are already being called, not because they know the name, but because they respond to the voice. So who is truly inside the covenant? Is it the one who holds the title, or the one who listens and obeys? Balaam forces us to reconsider, and in doing so, he opens a door, one that may lead directly to where you are standing now. There are truths so vast they cannot be owned, only revealed. And Yahweh is not a tribal deity. He is not the private inheritance of a single people, nor the product of a nation's memory. He is, and always has been, the God of the whole earth. Long before Israel, before Moses, before altars were built or names were carved into stone, Yahweh had already been seen, already been heard, already been known. Psalm 113:3 says, "From the rising of the sun to its setting, the name of Yahweh is to be praised, not just in the temple, not just in Jerusalem, from east to west, in valleys and deserts, mountains and coastlands, in languages we've forgotten and songs no one remembers." The praise of Yahweh was never meant to be contained, it was always meant to overflow. And Paul, centuries later, writes in Romans chapter 1, 19-20, that what can be known about God has been made plain to all people, because his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. This is not poetic metaphor. This is doctrine. The fingerprints of Yahweh were laid on the world itself. Creation speaks his name. Conscience feels his breath. The hunger for him exists in every people group, every culture, every century. Because he was never hiding, he was sowing. Here is the reframe. What if Yahweh began sowing his name before history recorded it, before Torah named him, before Israel bore his ark? What if the knowledge of God was like light planted into the soil of human hearts, an eternal sunrise waiting to break through the night of forgetfulness? You don't need to have grown up in the faith to have been known by the Father. You don't need to have memorized Scripture to have been seen by the one who wrote it. Because long before you knew his name, he knew yours. And while others were drawing borders, he was planting seeds of memory, of wonder, of ache. Seeds that would one day rise as questions in your soul. Is there more? Is there someone? Can I know him? This is not just their story, it is yours. Because if Yahweh was known before Israel, he can be known outside it. And if he called worshippers from ancient hills and pagan cities, from tents in Midian and towers in Mesopotamia, then he is calling now from wherever you are. The light was never confined. It was scattered like fire across the edges of the map, waiting for hearts to turn toward it. You are not late. You are not disqualified. You are not an afterthought in the plan of God. You are a thread in the same tapestry he's been weaving since the beginning. Yahweh is not the God of a few. He is the God of all who dare to seek him. And maybe that's why you're watching this now. Not because you stumbled here, but because he sowed something in you long ago. And today, it begins to rise. You were always meant to know that name, not just to pronounce it, but to belong to it. Not just to study it from a distance, but to live under its covering. Yahweh is not a name you stumble upon. It's a name that calls to you. A name written across generations and geography. A name that was echoing before you were born and still waits to be answered now. This is the truth too many were never told. The covenant didn't begin with Israel, and it certainly didn't end there. It wasn't forged to be exclusive, but to be revealed. It was not designed to build a wall, but to open a door. A door into a relationship with the God who was never the invention of a people, but the creator of all people. And if that covenant once lived in the hearts of men like Enosh, Job, Melchizedek, Jethro, people without title, without lineage, without temple, then that same covenant can live in you. It already calls you by name. You don't need a priesthood to be invited. You don't need ancestry to be seen. You don't need perfect understanding to be welcomed. You only need to respond. Because in the fullness of time, the name Yahweh was made flesh and dwelt among us. He walked dusty roads. He healed broken bodies. He called fishermen, outcasts, widows, and enemies. He didn't rewrite the covenant. He fulfilled it. And he carried the ancient name in himself. Yeshua, Yahweh saves. This is not a message of heritage, it's a message of invitation. a call to step into the same story that began before the earth had borders. You were not born too late. You were not born in the wrong place. You are not an afterthought in a plan that only includes a few. If you have felt overlooked, unwanted, or uncertain of your place in the story of God, hear this now. You were never outside. You were always meant to know that name, always meant to be found, always meant to be folded into the covenant that was breathing before the law and reaching long after it. This is not just their inheritance, it can be yours. So the question is no longer whether Yahweh is your God. The question is, will you be His? Will you turn toward the name that has been calling you through history, through longing, through quiet moments when you almost gave up on being seen? Because the name is still calling, and now you know it.